Tim Brown, certainly the best-known strategic industrial design, is that a good way of describing company in the world?
Thank you.
Anyway.
Okay, thanks. I haven't actually got anything to talk about in my presentation that talks about vulnerability, but Richard just mentioned Gilbert and Sullivan, and I thought you might be interested to know that my first and only performance on stage as a schoolboy was as a bridesmaid in a performance of Ruddigore, which is one of Gilbert and Sullivan's productions, at the age of about 13 or something. So.
Collaboration, because that's the collaboration where
it was a great collaboration.
And they both disliked each other, vehemently.
They fell out several times.
Yes, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to talk about the role that design thinking is playing in healthcare today. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about what design thinking is, at least in my opinion. This gentleman, who any Brits in the room might recognize, is Isambard Kingdom Brunel, and he was a great engineer, worked in the 19th century, created many great innovations, including the Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol and the Thames Tunnel at Rotherhithe. But perhaps his best-known innovation, his best-known creation, is the Great Western Railway, which runs from London to the west coast of England. And I grew up very close to it. And in fact, I used to pedal my bicycle along the side of the railway when I was a young kid, just to wait to watch the big express trains roar past, much to the consternation of my mother. You can see his railway represented here in J.M.W. Turner's painting Rain, Steam and Speed. What was remarkable, I think, about Brunel was that he was more than an engineer. And what he talked about wanting to achieve with this railway for his passengers was the experience of floating across the countryside. Now, this is one of the first major railways ever to get built, and to have that kind of vision of how it was going to be an experience for people, not just a technological innovation, I think was quite remarkable. And in order to achieve that, he demanded building the flattest gradients that had ever yet been built, including long viaducts over river valleys. This is the River Thames at Maidenhead, and long tunnels, such as the one at Box in Wiltshire. But he didn't stop there. He didn't stop with just trying to design the best railway journey he could. He wanted to design an integrated transportation system where it was possible to get on a train in London and get off a ship in New York. One journey from London to New York. And this is the SS Great Western, one of the first transatlantic steamships that he built to take care of that journey. Now, I think that what Brunel was doing was using what I call design thinking to create great innovations and really sort of design systems that were changing the world around us. The design thinking starts with what Roger Martin, who's the dean of the Rotman School at School of Business in Toronto, calls integrative thinking, which is this ability to hold opposing constraints in our heads and use those to create new ideas. In design, I think this means balancing desirability, what we need, with economic viability and technological feasibility. But there was something else about Brunel that I think was interesting. And that is when he worked. He worked in a time of great change. You know, he did all of his innovation in the 19th century when industrialization was changing the world around us. It was changing every aspect of the economy and the world in which we lived. And while many of those industrial systems have run their course, and in fact, you could argue are part of the problem today, we still live in a time of incredible change. And in times of change, we need new choices. And we need new choices because our existing, okay, there we go, all right. Because our existing alternatives are becoming obsolete, and we need new ideas to replace them. But why is design thinking useful? because it encourages us to approach problem solving differently. Instead of taking our normal convergent approach, where we make the best choices out of existing alternatives, it encourages us to diverge, to create new choices, to create new alternatives that haven't existed before. But before we can make that process, or carry out that process of divergence, there's an important first step. And that first step is, so what's the question that we're going to ask? So Brunel may have asked this question. Don't know if he did, but he may have done. How do I take a train from London to New York? So what are the kinds of questions that we might ask, perhaps as designers, about healthcare today? What are the kinds of things that we might be working on, that we might be thinking about? So I'd like to spend the rest of my few minutes with you talking about some of those questions. The first is, how do we do more with less? There's no doubt that technology will continue to make disruptive breakthroughs that allow us to progress our knowledge and our ability in healthcare. But sometimes I think we forget that there are perhaps ways of creating new efficiencies, new productivities in healthcare that are not based on brand new technologies. Now, design is, at its very heart, human-centered. It begins with what it may integrate technology and economics, but it begins with what people need, what makes life better, makes life easier, what makes technology useful and usable. And that's more than simply good ergonomics. In this case, when it came to working on improving vision screening in India, it was important to know the kind of motivations and aspirations of these kids, to know how they might play a role in screening the eyes of their parents. Convergent Sound has developed an ultra-low-cost, high-quality digital hearing aid for developing markets. Now, in the West, these hearing aids are fitted by highly trained technicians. And in India, these technicians simply don't exist. And so it took a team working in India with patients and community health workers to figure out how a PDA application might replace the technician in a fitting and diagnostic service. Again, instead of starting with technology, the team started with people and culture and spent their time in India. Mark Koska recognized that unsafe injection practices were a major issue in developing countries. And indeed, one child dies every 24 seconds through unsafe injection practices. And what he realized was that instead of simply tackling the problem of how the syringe may not get disposed of properly, or it may end up out in the street being used as a water pistol by kids, which is what happens, that the best thing was to step back and look at the design of the syringe itself. And so he developed the K1 auto-disable syringe where the stem breaks after one operation and simply cannot be reused. Startup IMI, now called Intercell, has developed a patch for delivering vaccines. The role of design here was to figure out how we could apply a patch and abrade the skin in order for the molecules to get through the skin in a very simple and intuitive way. The benefit of this is that the patch uses significantly less vaccine to deliver the drug and doesn't need a cold chain, which is a major advantage in the delivery of AIDS vaccines and other kinds of vaccines, particularly in the developing world. And the patch is now in phase 2 trials. So another question. How do we move away from thinking about health as sickness and think about health as a life skill? Can we encourage kids to understand health in such a way that they know how to manage their own health as they get older? Can we use technologies like Facebook, but with a health outcome instead of merely a community outcome? Can we use technology to connect nutrition, exercise, and health? One of our teams at IDEO has recently been working with the CDC on a program looking at childhood obesity, and particularly how to encourage kids to eat more vegetables, which I have to say is perhaps one of the toughest design challenges I've ever come across. And in the end, it's going to be about encouraging kids, ultimately encouraging all of us, towards new behaviors, which, just like thinking about Brunel, is about designing systems. It's not about any one single kind of magic bullet. In a similar kind of project, we've been working with around unplanned pregnancy and looking at how we might decrease unplanned pregnancy in young adults. And developed a sort of website that's a service that helps people make better choices. You can see here one page from it, which is a page that helps people choose different forms of contraception. I imagine some of these work better than others. But the important thing was how to encourage people to use a service like this. And so part of this program was a program that went out to colleges and workplaces, looking at kind of trying to encourage people to come and use the system. So here on the left is a poster that makes some comment on the average parenting skills of the average 20-year-old male. And on the right is a sticker that goes into a bathroom, a women's bathroom. And you might not get it exactly from this photograph, but you might get it from this one of the prototype. So the sticker is actually only the bottom half. So it gives you a kind of really a sense of what it might be like, just to project forward into the future and imagine this kind of rather major change that might happen. So I'd like here to go back to this idea of consumption, but in a slightly different way, and talk about this notion that perhaps we're going to have to move from this idea of a passive relationship between people, patients, consumers, and the producers that create services to a much more interactive relationship, much more participative relationship, where we are each engaged in experiences that are useful, valuable, and meaningful. So an example of that I'd like to talk about, another British example, apologize for that, but this is Sir William Beveridge. And in 1942, he created the first of his famous reports that established the British welfare state. By the time he wrote his third report, he admitted that, oh, sorry, I missed something important there, in which he had hoped, with his first report, to create a society of people who were actively engaged in their own welfare. By the time he produced his third report, he admitted that he'd failed, and in fact created a society of welfare consumers. And we're still living with that in the UK 50 or 60 years later. So Hilary Cottam, Charlie Ledbetter, and Hugo Manasai of a design organization called Participle have been rethinking this idea and trying to reinvent this notion of participation. And in their manifesto called Beveridge 4.0, they've proposed a new way of doing that. And this is one of their projects called Southwark Circle, in which they did in South London with a community of the aged, in which they worked with 150 elderly people and their families to develop a new kind of service in which the community participated in helping the aged take care of household tasks. And it has now been launched and been running for the last 6 months or so, based on a new kind of business model, really, that the British government has launched called social enterprises that sit somewhere halfway between for-profit and not-for-profit organizations. And I think this idea of participation, where perhaps the whole community or us as individuals takes a much more active role in the kinds of services that we expect, are going to be especially important as we think forward, as we each take more and more personal responsibility for our healthcare. We've seen one example already of this sort of collaboration between North and South that gets to innovation with Mark Koska's auto-disable syringe. But there are other ways of doing it, and other ways perhaps going beyond the creation of products to creation of platforms. This is something called the Human-Centered Design Toolkit that was created in a project with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to help NGOs who were working in the field to do a better job of understanding and responding to the needs of the people that they were serving in their process of innovation. It's really a field book, if you like, for design for NGOs. The toolkit has now been downloaded by about 12,000 times in 143 different countries, and it's been used to help vision screening in India. It's been used to design new ways of supporting farmers in Cambodia and East Africa, and new ideas for water distribution in Kenya. Much has been talked about in the press about the Aravind Eye Hospital. It's a wonderful institution that manages to treat enormous numbers of patients, many of them for free, by cross-subsidizing from those patients that can afford to pay to help cover the ones that can't. And they're an incredibly efficient organization, but they're also a very innovative one. This is actually the production facility, the manufacturing facility for one of their bigger breakthroughs, I think. It's the place where they manufacture their own intraocular lenses that replace those that are damaged by cataracts. What was remarkable, I felt, when I went and visited this was that they use a kind of a prototyping approach to develop this. So instead of building a big fancy new factory and using the very sort of sophisticated large-scale machinery that Western manufacturers use, they put this factory in the basement of one of their hospitals, and they use low-cost CAD/CAM prototyping machinery to make the lenses. And they're now the biggest manufacturer of these lenses in the developing world. And they finally recently just moved into their own factory. So I think what Aravind speaks to is this idea of moving as quickly as we can from thinking about what to build to building in order to think. In other words, using prototyping to move our ideas forward very quickly and learn about them and get our innovations out into the world as fast as we can. And in places where those users that you're designing for are extreme users, such as very, very poor patients in India, I think we can get to extreme innovations. And I think it was already been mentioned today that I see many examples of these sorts of innovations potentially coming back to us in the North. So how do we kind of get design to out of the hands of designers and into the hands of everyone so that it can help with healthcare? The Human-Centered Design Toolkit was one example of that, but there are others and other ways of doing it. And in a program carried out by Kaiser Permanente, looking at how can we improve the quality of the patient experience, teams of nurses and other practitioners worked on a project around redesigning how nurses exchange knowledge, and in particular how they change shift. And so a team of nurses used a design process based on observational research, brainstorming new solutions, and rapid prototyping to develop a new way of changing shift. Instead of retreating to the nurses' station to talk about the various states and needs of patients, they developed a new approach on the ward in front of patients using a new software tool. And by doing this, they brought the average time that they were away from patients down from 40 minutes to just 12 minutes. They increased patient confidence and increased nurse happiness. And when you multiply this by all the nurses on all the wards in the 35 hospitals at Kaiser, it results in a significant impact. And this is just one of the opportunities, I think, for kind of design and innovation to make a difference in healthcare, if we get it out of the hands of designers. One last sort of kind of interesting and I think important question that we've got a team working on right now. In fact, I bumped into the team on their way back from East Africa as I was flying back here from the UK at the weekend. How might we improve access to safe drinking water for some of the world's poorest people, and at the same time stimulate innovation amongst local water providers? So this is a project that we've been working on with, again, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and with the social investment fund, the Acumen Fund, based in New York. So instead of having a bunch of American designers sitting in California coming up with new ideas that may or may not have been appropriate, we tried to take a more kind of open and collaborative approach. And we teamed designers and investment experts up with 11 different water organizations across India and had them brainstorm in workshops, brainstorm new services, new products, and new business models. We then held a competition and awarded seed funding to 5 of those organizations, who then iterated on their ideas and developed prototypes. And Acumen investment experts and IDEO designers worked with these teams for many weeks, developing new prototypes of community engagement strategies, new business models, new social outreach campaigns, and new vessels for transporting water, and new carts for distribution. The results are only just coming out into the market right now, but we're just starting to see some interesting results. In one case, an NGO that develops village-scale water filtration systems has found that by redesigning the way they reach out to the community, they can increase subscriptions to clean water by 4 times. And the same set of activities is now going on, as I just mentioned, in East Africa. So for me, this kind of project shows how we might take a slightly different approach to design when it comes to some of the healthcare issues that we're tackling. How by focusing on the needs of users, by using prototypes to develop ideas more quickly, getting the process out of the hands of designers and into the hands of the community can make a difference in how we tackle some of these complex questions. And just like Brunel, by thinking about systems, ultimately design can have a bigger impact. So just to finish up, I think that I believe that design thinking can have a significant impact on healthcare and help create important new innovations. But to do that, we have to take a more expansive approach, and the first step is to start asking the right questions. Thanks a lot.